subject looked really interesting this morning, so I'm looking forward to it.
Well, let's hope.
I think welcome to Adult Forum. I think many of you have already met or know Reverend Dr. Brian Stratton. He's our best Renaissance man who's locally available with a fount of knowledge of history and logic, and also an ordained Presbyterian pastor. So we're very fortunate today for him to help us think through, I'll jump to a possible conclusion, how we should help shape our behavior. Welcome.
Nelson. Everybody hear me okay?
Yes,
Okay. All right.
I'll let them.
How about out in the, everybody hear me okay out in the?
Yes, at least I can.
Well, today I've got a topic that's far too big for me to cover, not only in terms of the amount of time that I have, but also in terms of my ability. So, but I will do my best to try to be interesting for 50 minutes here or so. So, I asked Carol, well, when Nelson had invited me to do another adult forum, I said, well, is there any particular subjects? And Carol told me that justice is one of the themes for this year. So I gave it a little thought and decided that I would do just some remarks on justice, sort of how it's been understood in Western thought, and then perhaps try to offer some suggestions. Nelson, did you want to say anything about the recording now? Or
I think we're all right on that topic for now. Thank you.
okay, thanks, Nelson. All right. Well, I'm going to start, since the title of this talk is Egoism, Altruism, and Justice. And I know you folks probably can't see very well what I've got on the board, but hopefully that won't be much of a hindrance. Let me first say what I'm going to mean by egoism and altruism. And then I'm not going to define justice right away because that's a big part of what we're going to be looking at over the course. So first off, let me say, I'm going to, all of this stuff could be debated and rambled around. But I'm going to call egoism an individual fulfilling his or her own goods. Egoism will be the desire to fulfill our own. And then altruism will be desiring to fulfill the goods of another. And egoism, or one's own good, and altruism, the common good or the good of the other, are often seen in conflict and in philosophy. But let me go, I want to start with one of the most famous and influential passages about justice that's ever been written. And so I'm going to go all the way back to the ancient Greeks, and I'm going to share with you a story and a quote from the historian Thucydides. And Thucydides lived about 460 to 400 BCE. He's generally considered to be the father of what is known as scientific history, because unlike his great predecessor Herodotus, he tried to write his history without any reference to deities or miracles or omens or this kind of thing. So Thucydides, in a sense, saw himself as kind of a more scientific, for lack of a better way to put it. He's probably closer to a modern historian, far closer than Herodotus. Also, Thucydides, sometimes referred to by scholars as one of the founders of realpolitik, or realpolitik. That is, Thucydides, in his history, basically takes the attitude that almost all political movements that happen, or all countries and how they govern themselves, are motivated by two things. fear, and self-interest. And so that in order for a country, a nation, whatever to function, basically it's an interplay between these two things and balancing the fear and self-interest of other countries and what they might think, and trying to come to some kind of terms. Thomas Hobbes, who if I have time, I'll talk a little bit about in his notion of justice later. And sometimes he gets lumped in as perhaps a precursor of Machiavelli. Thucydides himself doesn't really seem to want to moralize much. It's probably safe to describe him as, some would say, realistic. Almost, I would say, has an almost cynical or pessimistic view, because he does not believe that human history is moving in any positive moral direction, but rather that things kind of just happen according to these struggles between self-interest and fear. And so when he writes about what's taking place in the Peloponnesian War and the war between Athens and Sparta, he doesn't really so much condemn any of the parties involved, but just sort of reports it as, well, this is what to be expected. This is how things are. So let's go. Chapter 17 of the history of the Peloponnesian War, which I have with me, which is known as, it's a very famous passage, it's known as the Melian Conference. Because Athens is getting ready to interact in the war with the island of Melos. And Melos, a very small island, not terribly significant. They were theoretically aligned with Sparta historically, but the Melians wanted nothing to do with the Peloponnesian War. Athens and Sparta are going at it hammer and tongs to see who's going to be the most important thing in Greece. The Melians take the attitude, we're a small island, we're mostly a farming people, we just want to be left alone, raise our families, right, and be at peace. We have no interest in the warfare or the struggles of these big, huge powers looking for dominance. Let us be. We won't harm you. We won't help you. Just want. And this is what the Athenian ambassador says to the leader of Melos. For ourselves, we shall not trouble you with specious pretenses, either of how we have a right to our empire because we overthrew the Persians, or are now attacking you because of any wrongs that you have allegedly done us. And we will not make a long speech, which would not be believed anyway. And in return, we hope that you, instead of thinking to influence us by saying you did not join with our enemies, although you are their colonists, or that you have done us no wrong, we'll aim at what is feasible. That is, we will hold in view the real sentiments of us both. And here's the money quote. Since you know, as well as we do, that right, as the world goes, is only in question between equals in power. While the strong do what they can, weak suffer what they must. So, the dialogue goes on for quite a long time with the people of Melos appealing to justice, to the gods, to the good nature of the Athenians, to what's right in some abstract sense. And then in the last passage, we're told what happens. Hellions answer that they will not support Athens in their outcome as reported by Thucydides. Hellions surrendered at the discretion of the Athenians, put to death all the grown men of the island, and sold the women and children for slaves, subsequently sent out 500 colonists and inhabited the island for themselves. This is a pretty dismal story, isn't it? I mean, it's horrible that here you have this power that says, we don't care what's right, we don't care what's wrong, we can take what you have, and therefore we'll take it. And there's not a thing you can do with that. I hate to be the one to share that with you on a Sunday morning. That's grimmer than anything in the book of Revelation, isn't it, kids? Notice there, if our two poles, egoism, the individual fulfilling his or her own desire, altruism, seeking to fulfill the good or the desire of another, which way do our Athenians fall? It's almost too bad that Freud calls the conscience the superego, right? Because, you would think a conscience would keep the ego in check. These Athenians, now that's a superego, right? That's selfishness on steroids. This was a widely known passage in the ancient world and debated constantly. With some people saying, oh, well, sure, the Athenians, that's what they should have done. With other folks saying, gosh, isn't this horrible that this took place? And it made a profound and deep impact on both Socrates and Plato. Now, historians quibble, as we always do, about everything, right? As some have said that there's no evidence that Plato directly read Thucydides. Well, I beg to differ. I won't get into that, right? But Plato actually named some of the characters in his dialogues, actor characters in the history of the Peloponnesian War. And he actually put speeches in the mouths of some of his characters that if they had plagiarism rules back then, Plato might have gotten in trouble, right? Because it's clearly cribbing what Thucydides is having people say. And so Plato struggles with this idea. And so Plato thinks long and hard about this. And of course, as you folks know, Socrates often shows up as the hero, right? And so in one dialogue, I'll just mention this one, the Gorgias. Gorgias is a sophist philosopher who teaches rhetoric and who believes that rhetoric is the greatest of all the arts because through the power of speech and persuasion, can most effectively achieve well. What makes something the greatest art? That it serves this, right? So in the Gorgias, we have one of his early attempts to try to deal with this question, which he will later fully realize in the Republic, where he actually tries to define justice. He never does that for us. But let's talk about their conversation just for a little bit. In the story, Socrates goes to meet this great sophist philosopher, Gorgias, and they begin talking about various things that we often do. And part of it is more or less Gorgias defending this idea that might makes right, right? You can almost hear the very words coming out of Thucydides as he's doing this, right? And some of that goes along as you would pretty much expect it to. But then another character emerges in the conversation. This is what I'll talk about, Callicles, the student of Gorgias's. And Socrates argues against Gorgias's attempt of self-interest and power by saying no. And I won't get into the whole argument because forget how I'm such a windbag. Socrates says this, that it harms individuals more to do something wrong than it does to suffer wrong at the hand of it. Notice trying to get at this notion of what's right, what we should do, Gorgias and the others have been defending this pure egoism, right? Socrates is actually kind of doing a clever thing here, or Plato is having Socrates. He's saying it's actually in your best interest. Think about the good of others. Callicles just laughs and says that's ridiculous, right? Because everyone knows that to suffer at the hands of somebody else harms you far more than if you do something bad yourself. And then Socrates does some twisty, turny kind of things the way he does. But basically, here's the bottom line. The question, turn on this. Callicles is convinced that what is good in life is the same thing as what gives us pleasure. Good is pleasure. Socrates says no, good and pleasure cannot be the same thing. And he goes through a number of serious arguments to do this. I'll just mention a couple of them. Some of them I'll just summarize. For example, first of all, he argues there are such things as bad pleasures. Some things that people may find pleasurable, but nonetheless are actually quite harmful to them. He also argues that there's no such thing as, there is no such thing, though, as bad goodness. What is genuinely good for a person will not be bad. It will not be harmful if it's genuine. Then let me do this other, just real quick. He says something along, he sort of makes a joke at first, and Socrates says to Callicles, well, if you feel pleasure from scratching your head, that means we should spend our entire lives scratching our heads? Callicles thinks he's being silly. Well, he is to a certain extent. Or, and this is more serious, and I even hate to bring this up, but this is actually used in the text. If an unjust tyrant who's ruling a city takes pleasure from murdering and raping his citizens, does that make it good? No, it goes something like this. If a person is good, then they're good because they possess the attribute of goodness. If a person is evil, it's because they possess an attribute of evil. Our first person can be in pain, but still be good. Huh? So pain and goodness can go together. But our person that's evil can be pleased and also evil. So evil and pleasure can't go together, can they not? But evil and goodness not go together. So goodness cannot be the same thing. Pain. Yeah, go ahead, Harry.
A good person does an evil thing for a good purpose.
You may need to repeat the question for those out there.
Yeah, Harry, again, what if a good person does a
A
bad
good person does an evil thing for a good purpose.
Good person does an
Evil thing for a good purpose.
Well, that's a great question. The reason I is because I don't, it take me all day to answer, probably.
So we'll go to lunch now.
I'll say it this way. Whenever you analyze any ethical act, right, you have to think about three things, at least three. The motive, that is why they do it, the act itself, right, and then the consequences or the results. Now, in the example you just gave, you've got a person who's well-intentioned, but they do a bad thing, but it still turns out okay, right? Well, you would have to say that you could not call that incident something that is totally good. You could say it was good in aspect of motive, or you could say it was good in aspect of consequence, or both, but you would still be able to morally condemn the act itself. Because sometimes, well, some people do good by accident, don't they? Because that's what would, clearly that's what happened in there. The person's doing a bad thing, but they don't know, they don't think they are, turning out okay, right?
Well, actually, I had it the other way. The person knew that the evil thing he was doing was going to come out with a good result.
That's a little tougher, isn't it? They know it's evil. Now, I'll have to come back to you on that, okay? Because it's a great question. So, Socrates and Plato try to defend this idea that justice, properly understood, right, should be able to reach both those things. Because justice is truly good for the individual to practice, right? And it's also good for other people. Right? Despite these arguments, of course, it's not been settled that way by any stretch of the imagination among a lot of thinkers. And in fact, Plato writes a whole other dialogue, the Republic, because the same questions that he tries to deal with in this one, he's not satisfied with himself and tries to develop it in greater. Now, I'm going to gloss over now several centuries, but just to say it this way, even though Aristotle was far more positive about democracy than Plato, right, they both have very similar views on justice. There are some subtle distinctions and exceptions, but they basically believe that justice, properly understood, will reconcile these. On the other hand, if you believe, as did the Athenians and the others, that there is no such thing as a justice that can reconcile, there's only strength and power and advertisement, then you're not going to accept an argument like this. But Plato would say, well, you may not want to accept it, but I've got reason on my side. That's Plato's heart. Right? If you're arguing with a person that is absolutely convinced that the only good in life is pleasure, and that's what they want more than anything, I think reason's really going to get the job done. It's hard. Right? To be critical and to try to think things out, right? But you folks know other disciplines, confirmation bias is our default wiring as human beings. We don't necessarily want to think differently or in different ways. It's not easy. So anyway, we've got this tension, and this tension is going to emerge again. The Greeks get forgotten by and large, along with the Middle Ages. And so the new rise of modern science leads to a whole different way of thinking about the world and whole different ways of thinking about human beings. Let me just mention, I'll do one thinker from that period and then try to move to something more contemporary. Thomas Hobbes, political philosopher, one of the most influential of all time, loved Thucydides. In fact, Thomas Hobbes was the first person to translate Thucydides from Greek into English because he thought Thucydides had just hit the nail right on the head. Hobbes believed that human beings were naturally at war with one another. And in the state of nature, which he believes is our pristine state, right? It's the war of all against all. And in the state of nature, life is, as he describes it, nasty, brutish, This is what rules how all human beings act and behave. This altruism, whenever you think is really just this in disguise. Just a different form of power manipulation, according to Hobbes. For Hobbes, he believed you needed a strong, powerful state because we don't naturally want to do anything like this that will force us to bend our wills so at least we can survive. About what it means. But with him and with Locke and with some of these other things, tend to have another idea introduced to you. That is from the French, from Rousseau, rights. Notice when I talked about these things, I talked about desiring goods. Right? As we move into this period, people no longer really want to talk about desiring goods as such. Talk about rights. And of course, John Locke was one most influential in doing this. And his ideas about justice have influenced a lot of people. And I'm just going to mention a couple of contemporary thinkers real quick, because you can still see this egoism, altruism playing itself out. The most influential theorist of justice in contemporary philosophy is John Rawls. He is challenged, on the other hand, by Robert Nozick, because then I'll also mention McIntyre, assuming I have time. Right? Rawls basically sees, because he's trying to balance these two things, egoism and altruism, and he defines justice using Locke's idea of rights, right, as fairness. Every individual is endowed with personal rights. And the reason we participate in society or the social contract is so we can maximize those rights. But he believes that if everybody started from a true ground zero, then we might have fairness in society. But everybody doesn't start out on a truly equal plane, do they? Doesn't take much to look at the world to see that. And Rawls tells this delightful little story in his book where he says that his book, The Theory of Justice, that he basically learned what he knows about justice from his mother. When he and his brother were little boys, and you would get down to the last two pieces of cake, trying to figure out how to divide it. This is how his mother taught him to do it. Say something like, Tommy, you get to cut the cake. But your brother gets to pick first. And you may be greedy and want to cut yourself a big old huge slab off that cake, but if your brother gets to pick first, you've lost out, right? And so Rawls goes through all these elaborate things about, and they're good, don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to make fun of them, about how our society should actually be involved in creating a social strata that allows every individual to maximize his or her personal rights. And you're not able to do that if you come out of a completely unlevel playing field. Some people, from birth, it's like they've won the lottery, isn't it? Other people can barely stumble to get out of the gate. So if you read the theory of justice, Rawls will go through all this, different things, and many of them I think are probably pretty good ideas, but how we should kind of level the playing field so people can maximize their individual rights. On the other hand, is like Rawls. He agrees in the Lockean tradition of rights, and that justice is basically the being sure that people have those rights. But he defines it differently. He defines justice as entitlement. So that justice is what a person is entitled to. He's less interested in a level playing field out of the gate than he is being sure that people that are high achievers are entitled to what they have achieved. So now, again, egoism, altruism. The purpose of society, the individual can either get as much as they can, right, maximize their rights, or keep their achievements. Now, Rawls, in fairness, thinks that this will come about, or that society should be set up to sort of help that come about. But he's not really that interested. Thinking about it in terms of so much common good for him means maximizing the individual in terms of his or her own individual. Maximizing the individual getting to keep their just rewards. That's a little oversimplified, but it seems to me that neither of these two conceptions of justice are going to get us very far. We're creating a more just world. Because to me, it seems like they're still way too focused on the egoism. Let me mention one last modern thinker. Try to take some questions. And that is Alistair McIntyre. McIntyre disagrees with both these two because he thinks that the tradition that they represent, the tradition of individual rights, is not really all that conducive to a common good. Says that we should think of justice not as maximizing individual rights, but we should think of justice the way the ancient Greeks did, virtue. And in this, instead of setting society up to kind of reward a playing field, right, or setting society up to allow certain people to be at play in the fields of the Lord, as it were, McIntyre says we should try to put structures in place that will actually compensate, not necessarily financially, but compensate or reward people based on their contributions to the common good. Now, I don't know if that's even possible for us to do today, right? But it's certainly an intriguing idea, is it not? That the people we reward or award or whatever word you want to use most in society are the people that actually contribute the most. Because it's certainly not set up that way now, is it? Again, not trying to be too pessimistic. Now, I don't know if, as I said, I don't know if McIntyre's way of thinking is even possible. Right? Because I don't know what it would take to revolutionize our society to the point that we would actually start to do this. Right? Maybe it'd take a revolution. I don't know. Right? But anyway, this idea of justice not being simply something that reflects this, nor is it something that simply reflects this, because we do want to take care of individuals as well, right? We don't want to completely sacrifice individuals for some theoretical common good, right? So we need something to preserve both these things. I promised I'd quit in time to take questions, so I'm going to have to not even talk about the last thing I was going to talk about. A thinker that used to be one of the most widely read, but is now lost for the most part, is the clergyman, Bishop Joseph Butler. He wrote 2 works. One was 15 sermons on human nature. The other was analogies of religion, both natural and revealed. These, Butler, I wish I had time to talk about it. Butler is one of the great moralists of all time, because we philosophers, we argue about it, we can't. But almost everybody agrees that Butler effectively demolished a virtue of selfishness. That his arguments against a kind of egoistic ethic are so powerful, it's hard to see how anybody that's read him could still defend this kind of stuff we started with all the time. So, again, don't get anything else good out of this, right? Maybe if I encourage you to read some Butler, that'd be good. I wish we could get him back more widely known. I warn you though, even though they're 15 sermons, they're not like most sermons you're going to hear. They really are more like tightly reasoned logical treatises. So, no offense to the clergy in the room, but you can't say those sermons are tightly reasoned logical treatises. But Butler tries to show that there is absolutely properly understood no incompatibility between egoism, altruism. I better hush. I promised I'd take some questions.
Problem with setting up a society that rewards good, that there's no metric for measuring good. And isn't that why the capitalist model won? Because they have a metric for measuring success.
That's a great question, Harry. Yeah, Harry asked, is one of the problems we can't set up a society that rewards the good because we don't have a metric for measuring good, right? And capitalism does have a metric for measuring success, I guess. That could be one of the difficulties, I think. I also, if we got together and pooled our minds, I'm not so sure we couldn't come up with some kind of metric. Now, I'm not going to say we would all agree about it in every detail. We clearly wouldn't, right? But we could probably come up with some basic values of decency, for lack of a better thing to call them, that most people should be able to get on.
The Wizard of Oz, it was a medal.
Well, yeah.
And I suppose now it's a medal in social or civic clubs and things of that nature. When you succeed, you get to be a key man or a spark plug or whatever it is. But in the general society, you're not organized to reward the good with any kind of particular metric.
Yeah, and that's where I would think, yeah, that would be one of the difficulties is how do we come up with one? You know, and what would that look like? I mean, for some people, they may want to be rewarded financially. For others, they may want to be rewarded in other ways. I don't know. I mean, it would be long and hard to think that through. But I don't think we would have to invent the thing from whole cloth. I think if we do go back, and now some of my biases out there, I guess, If we do go back to the wisdom of the ancient traditions, like Plato and Aristotle and stuff, not adopt them uncritically, because there's a lot in there, you know, Plato absolutely did not think you should have slavery or women subjected. Aristotle, on the other hand, reversed Plato on that. So I'm not saying we want to go back to the whole cloth, but I think some of the things they talk about, like their basic discussions of the virtues, about a life that's devoted to finding truth, goodness, and beauty, some of these kinds of things, I think we could start, you know, they could be conversation partners to sort of help us move into a healthier society than what we're seeing right now. Other questions? Anybody from